In the unforgiving deserts of Afghanistan, where the line between life and death is measured in split seconds, there exists a brotherhood that few understand. The Navy SEALs, America's most elite warriors, are trained to face the impossible. But even they have limits. Even they have missions they call suicide. What happens when a female Air Force major, flying a machine built for destruction, refuses to accept that some battles cannot be won? What happens when courage meets desperation at 30,000 feet, and the only thing standing between victory and disaster is one pilot's refusal to give up? This is not a story about war. This is a story about the moment when ordinary people are forced to become extraordinary. This is about Major Sarah Chun, whose actions on one scorching afternoon in 2018 would redefine what it means to have someone's back. The SEALs called it suicide. She called it Tuesday. Some legends are born in boardrooms. Others are forged in the crucible of combat, where the only currency that matters is trust, and the only question that counts is, who's got your six? Major Sarah Chun had always been different. Growing up in a small town in Oregon, she was the girl who climbed trees higher than the boys, who fixed her own bike when it broke, and who dreamed of flying while other kids dreamed of being movie stars. Her parents, both engineers, had taught her that problems existed to be solved, not avoided. This philosophy would serve her well in the years to come, especially on a day when the impossible became necessary. The morning of July 15th, 2018, started like any other at Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan. The sun rose mercilessly over the dusty landscape, promising another day of scorching heat and tension. Sarah completed her pre-flight checks on her A-10 Thunderbolt II, an aircraft affectionately known as the Warthog for its ungainly appearance and fierce reputation. The A-10 wasn't pretty, but it was effective. Built around a massive 30mm cannon, it was designed for one purpose: providing close air support to ground troops. Sarah had been flying combat missions for 3 years, but she never got tired of the ritual. Each switch, each gauge, each system had to be perfect. Lives depended on it. As she ran through her checklist, her crew chief, Sergeant Martinez, approached with a mission briefing. "Morning, Major," Martinez said, handing her the folder. "Looks like you've had a hot one today." Sarah opened the briefing and immediately understood what he meant. A Navy SEAL team, call sign Razor 6, had been conducting a reconnaissance mission near the Pakistan border when they stumbled upon a major Taliban operation. What was supposed to be a simple intelligence gathering mission had turned into a nightmare. The SEALs were now pinned down in a valley surrounded by enemy forces, vastly outnumbered and running low on ammunition. The geography made everything worse. The valley was narrow, surrounded by steep mountains that limited approach angles. Traditional close air support would be difficult, if not impossible. The SEALs were trapped in what military tacticians call a kill box, a confined area where the enemy held all the advantages. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, the SEAL team leader, had been in combat for over a decade. He had survived missions that would have broken lesser men, but as he pressed his back against the rocky outcrop that provided their only cover, he knew this might be different. His team of 8 men was facing an estimated 60 Taliban fighters, with more arriving every hour. "Sir," his radio operator, Petty Officer Reynolds, crawled over with the latest communication. "Air support is en route. 1 A-10, call sign Hawkeye 7. ETA 20 minutes. Morrison nodded, but his expression remained grim. One aircraft against this many enemy fighters in this terrain was like bringing a knife to a gunfight. He had seen close air support work wonders, but he had also seen it fail when the odds were too steep. The Taliban fighters weren't amateurs. They had been fighting in these mountains for years, and they knew how to use the terrain to their advantage. 20 miles away, Sarah was already in the air, pushing her A-10 toward the coordinates she had been given. As she flew over the rugged landscape, she used the radio to establish contact with the ground team. "Razor 6, this is Hawkeye 7. I'm inbound to your position. What's your situation?" Morrison's voice crackled through the static. "Hawkeye 7, we are danger close to multiple enemy positions. We've got fighters on 3 sides, with more moving to close off our only escape route. They're well dug in and have at least 2 machine gun nests that we can identify. Sarah studied the terrain through her aircraft's targeting system. The valley was even more challenging than the briefing had indicated. The mountains rose sharply on both sides, creating a natural funnel that would force her to approach at a steep angle. The enemy positions were scattered across the hillsides, making it nearly impossible to engage them without risking hitting the friendly forces below. Copy that, Razor 6. I'm going to make a pass and see what we're dealing with. As Sarah descended into the valley, she immediately understood why this mission had been labeled as extremely hazardous. The Taliban fighters had chosen their positions well. They controlled the high ground, and their weapons were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Any aircraft attempting to provide close air support would have to fly directly into their crosshairs. But Sarah also saw something else. The enemy fighters were confident, perhaps overconfident. They had spread themselves across a wide area, believing that their numbers and positions made them invulnerable. This confidence might become their weakness, but only if she could find a way to exploit it. Razor 6, I count approximately 50 enemy fighters in fixed positions across the eastern ridge, with mobile elements moving to surround your position. This isn't going to be easy. Morrison's response was immediate. Hawkeye 7, we understand the risk. Do what you can, but don't get yourself killed trying to save us. That's an order. Sarah smiled grimly. She had heard similar orders before, usually from ground commanders who were trying to be noble in impossible situations. But she hadn't become a pilot to play it safe. She had joined the Air Force because she believed that sometimes doing the right thing meant ignoring the safe thing. The first attack run was a probing action. Sarah approached from the north, using the morning sun to mask her approach. She targeted the machine gun nest that posed the greatest threat to the SEAL team, unleashing a burst from her 30mm cannon. The explosive rounds tore through the enemy position, silencing the weapon and scattering the fighters. But the victory was temporary. As Sarah pulled up and banked for another pass, tracer rounds streaked past her cockpit. The enemy had been waiting for her to reveal herself, and now they were focusing their fire on her aircraft. Taking heavy fire, Sarah reported as her aircraft shuddered from multiple impacts. I've got damage to my left engine, but I'm still flying. The situation on the ground wasn't improving either. While Sarah's first attack had eliminated one threat, the Taliban fighters were adapting. They began moving in small groups, using the terrain to avoid her targeting systems while maintaining pressure on the SEAL team. Morrison watched as enemy fighters began flanking their position. His team was running low on ammunition, and several of his men were wounded. The rocky outcrop that had provided protection was becoming a trap. Soon, they would be completely surrounded with no way out. Hawkeye 7, we need you to hit the group moving along the southern ridge. They're about to cut off our escape route. Sarah could see the fighters Morrison was talking about. They were moving in single file along a narrow ledge, carrying what appeared to be rocket-propelled grenades. If they reached their destination, they would have a clear shot at the SEAL team's position. But engaging them would require flying directly between the mountain walls at low altitude through concentrated enemy fire. It was the kind of mission that flight instructors used as examples of what not to do. It was also the only way to save the men on the ground. Copy that, Razor 6. I'm going in. Sarah rolled her aircraft into a steep dive, descending into the valley like a falcon stooping on its prey. The mountain walls flashed past her wingtips as tracer rounds crisscrossed the air around her. Her targeting system locked onto the enemy fighters, and she squeezed the trigger. The 30mm cannon roared to life, sending a stream of explosive shells into the enemy formation. Bodies tumbled from the rocky ledge as the surviving fighters scrambled for cover. But Sarah's victory came at cost. As she pulled out of the dive, multiple impacts rocked her aircraft. I'm hit bad, she reported, her voice tight with concentration. Left engine is gone, and I'm losing hydraulic pressure. But I'm still in the fight. Her aircraft was damaged, but not destroyed. The A-10 had been designed to take punishment and keep flying. Sarah assessed her remaining capabilities and realized she still had options. Her cannon was operational, and she had enough fuel for several more attack runs. But the enemy was learning too. They had realized that the lone aircraft was their primary threat, and they began coordinating their fire. Instead of engaging targets of opportunity, they focused on bringing down the A-10. Morrison could see the tracer fire converging on Sarah's aircraft as she made another attack run. The volume of fire was incredible, far more than any single aircraft should be expected to survive. Yet somehow, she kept flying, kept fighting. Hawkeye 7, you need to get out of here. We can't ask you to keep taking this kind of punishment. Negative, Razor 6. I didn't come all this way to quit now. Sarah's words were calm, but Morrison could hear the strain in her voice. Her aircraft was flying on borrowed time, and they both knew it. Yet she continued her attacks, systematically eliminating enemy positions despite the increasing damage to her aircraft. The battle had been raging for over an hour when Sarah noticed something that changed everything. The enemy fighters, focused on bringing down her aircraft, had begun abandoning their positions to get better firing angles. They were clustering together, presenting opportunities that hadn't existed before. Razor 6, I need you to be ready to move on my signal. I think I can create an opening, but you'll only have a small window. Morrison didn't ask for details. He trusted the pilot who had been keeping his team alive against impossible odds. We'll be ready. Sarah climbed her damaged aircraft to maximum altitude, using every bit of performance her wounded machine could provide. From this height, she could see the entire battlefield spread out below her. The enemy positions, the SEAL team's location, and, most importantly, the narrow escape route that led out of the valley. She had one chance to make this work. Her aircraft was barely flying, held together by determination and engineering. Her fuel was running low, and her weapon systems were operating on backup power. But she had enough for one final attack, one last chance to tip the balance. Rolling into a nearly vertical dive, Sarah aimed her aircraft not at any specific target, but at the center of the enemy formation. The Taliban fighters, seeing the damaged A-10 diving toward them, concentrated their fire on what they assumed was a desperate final attack. They were right about it being final. They were wrong about it being desperate. At the last possible moment, Sarah pulled out of the dive and engaged every target she could see. Her cannon roared continuously, unleashing the remainder of her ammunition in a devastating display of precision firepower. Enemy positions that had seemed impregnable moments before were reduced to smoking craters. Go, 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 Sarah transmitted as she pulled her smoking aircraft clear of the valley. The path is clear. Morrison and his team needed no further encouragement. They moved swiftly through the gap Sarah had created, covering the wounded and fighting their way toward the extraction point. Behind them, the surviving enemy fighters were too stunned and scattered to mount an effective pursuit. As the SEAL team reached safety, Sarah's aircraft finally succumbed to the damage it had sustained. Warning lights flashed across her instrument panel, and her remaining engine began to sputter. She had enough altitude to reach friendly territory, but landing was going to be a challenge. The emergency landing at a forward operating base was controlled chaos. Fire trucks and medical personnel stood ready as Sarah brought her battered aircraft in on final approach. The A-10 touched down hard, its damaged landing gear barely holding together as it rolled to a stop. When Sarah climbed out of the cockpit, she was surprised to find Morrison and his team waiting for her. The SEAL commander, still covered in dust and cordite, walked up to her with something she had never seen before, tears in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. What you did up there, we called it suicide. But you turned into something else entirely." Sarah looked at the men she had helped save, each one alive, because she had refused to accept that some missions were impossible. She thought about the decision she had made in the cockpit, the moment when she chose to fight rather than flee. "Commander," she said, removing her helmet and running a hand through her sweat-soaked hair. "Sometimes the difference between suicide and heroism is just a matter of perspective." But even as she spoke those words, Sarah knew that something had changed. The mission was over, the men were safe, but the story was just beginning. In the days and weeks that would follow, word of her actions would spread through the military community. The mission that had started as a routine close air support call had become something larger, something that would define not just her career, but her understanding of what it meant to serve. As the sun set over the Afghan mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Sarah Chun stood beside her damaged aircraft and realized that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that seem impossible to win. And sometimes refusing to accept defeat is the first step toward creating a legend. The weeks following the mission brought changes Sarah hadn't expected. News of her actions spread through the military community like wildfire, carried by the voices of 8 Navy SEALs who couldn't stop talking about the Air Force major who had refused to let them die. But fame, Sarah quickly learned, was a double-edged sword that cut in directions she never anticipated. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison kept his promise to spread the word. Within days of their extraction, he had filed a detailed after-action report that painted Sarah's performance in terms that military bureaucrats rarely saw. But Morrison didn't stop there. He personally called every contact he had in the Pentagon, the media, and the veterans community. In his mind, Sarah Chun deserved recognition not just for her skill, but for redefining what it meant to have someone's back. "You need to understand," Morrison told a reporter from Military Times during a phone interview from his hospital bed in Germany, where he was recovering from shrapnel wounds. "Major Chin didn't just provide close air support. She flew into hell itself, took a beating that should have brought down her aircraft, and kept fighting until every one of my boys was safe. I've been in this business for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like it." The story broke on a Thursday morning, and by Friday afternoon, Sarah's commanding officer, Colonel James Hawthorne, was fielding calls for news outlets, military officials, and politicians. The attention was overwhelming and not entirely welcome. "Chun," Colonel Hawthorne said as Sarah reported to his office 3 days after the mission, "we need to talk." Sarah entered the sparsely decorated office and took the seat across from Hawthorne's desk. The colonel was a career officer who had earned his position through competence rather than politics, and Sarah respected him for his straightforward approach to command. "Sir, if this is about the mission debrief, I've already filed my report." Hawthorne smiled and shook his head. "This isn't about your report, Major. Your report was exemplary, as usual. This is about the circus that's forming around you. I got requests from 3 major news networks, 2 documentary film crews, and a congressman who wants to nominate you for the Medal of Honor. How do you want to handle this?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had joined the military to serve, not to become a celebrity. The idea of cameras and interviews made her more nervous than flying through enemy fire. "I'd prefer to handle it quietly, sir. I was doing my job, nothing more." "Major, I admire your modesty, but this situation is bigger than your personal preferences now. The Pentagon is interested in your story because it demonstrates the effectiveness of close air support doctrine. The public is interested because they need heroes. And the Air Force is interested because we have a recruitment problem that stories like yours can help solve." Hawthorne leaned back in his chair and studied Sarah's face. He had commanded pilots for over 20 years, and he could read the signs of someone struggling with unwanted attention. "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to participate in a limited media campaign. 3 interviews, controlled settings, with the understanding that your primary mission remains flying combat operations. But Sarah," he paused to make sure he had her attention, "this story is going to be told whether you participate or not. At least this way, you can make sure it's told accurately." Sarah nodded reluctantly. She understood the colonel's logic, even if she didn't like it. Better to control the narrative than to let others define it for her. The first interview was with a veteran journalist from CNN who specialized in military affairs. Sarah agreed to the interview on the condition that it would focus on the mission and her team, not on her personal story. But as she sat across from the reporter in a conference room at Bagram, she quickly realized that controlling the narrative was more difficult than flying through enemy fire. "Major Chun," the reporter began, "you've been described as a hero by the men you saved. How does that make you feel?" "I feel grateful that we were able to complete the mission successfully and that all personnel made it home safely. But surely you must realize that what you did was extraordinary. You flew into what military experts are calling a kill zone and stayed there for over an hour while taking heavy fire. That goes beyond normal close air support operations." Sarah chose her words carefully. "Every mission has its unique challenges. My job was to provide support to ground forces, and that's what I did. I had an exceptional aircraft, excellent maintenance support, and detailed intelligence. The credit should go to the entire team." But the reporter pressed on, asking about her background, her family, her reasons for joining the military. Each question felt like an intrusion into the private world Sarah had carefully constructed around her professional identity. The second interview, with Stars and Stripes, went better. The military publication understood the culture Sarah came from, and the questions focused more on tactical decisions and operational challenges. But by the time the third interview was scheduled, Sarah was beginning to understand that her story had taken on a life of its own. Back home in the United States, the story was resonating in ways that surprised everyone involved. Social media exploded with posts about the Angel of Afghanistan, a nickname that made Sarah cringe but seemed to capture the public imagination. Veterans groups began using her story as an example of the military's commitment to leaving no one behind. Recruiters reported increased interest from young women considering military careers. But there was also pushback. Some critics questioned whether the mission had been worth the risk, whether sending a single aircraft into such dangerous territory was sound tactical doctrine. Others suggested that the story was being overblown for political reasons, part of a broader effort to promote women in combat roles. Sarah tried to ignore both the praise and the criticism, but isolation was becoming increasingly difficult. Her fellow pilots treated her differently now, with a mixture of admiration and distance that made normal relationships challenging. Some seemed to view her as untouchable, a living legend who existed on a different level from ordinary mortals. Others appeared resentful of the attention she was receiving for doing what they all did every day. The situation came to a head during a routine briefing 2 weeks after the mission. Captain Mike Williams, a pilot Sarah had considered a friend, made a comment that cut deeper than any criticism from the media. "Must be nice to be the poster child," Williams said as they walked out of the briefing room. "One mission, and suddenly you're famous. The rest of us have been flying the same missions for months, but nobody cares about that." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face Williams. The hurt in her voice was barely controlled as she responded. "Mike, I never asked for any of this. I didn't choose to become famous. I just did my job, the same way you do yours every day." "Yeah, well, your job seems to get a lot more attention than mine does." The confrontation might have escalated, but Captain Lisa Torres, another pilot in their squadron, stepped between them. "That's enough, both of you. Mike, you're out of line." Sarah didn't ask to become a celebrity, and she's handled this situation with more grace than most of us would. "And Sarah," Torres turned to face her, "you need to understand that this situation is affecting all of us. When one person in the squadron gets this kind of attention, it changes the dynamic for everyone." Torres was right, and Sarah knew it, but knowing didn't make the situation any easier to handle. That evening, she called her parents for the first time since the story broke. "Honey," her mother said, her voice filled with pride and concern, "we saw you on the news. Your father and I are so proud of you, but we're also worried. This kind of attention can be overwhelming." Sarah's father, ever practical, had different concerns. "Sarah, I've been reading some of the coverage online. Some people are saying things that worry me. They're making this about politics, about women in combat, about military spending. Are you prepared for this to get bigger? Sarah realized she hadn't been prepared for any of it. She had trained for combat, for emergencies, for equipment failures, and hostile fire. But no one had taught her how to handle being thrust into the spotlight, how to maintain her identity when others were trying to turn her into a symbol. The turning point came during an unexpected encounter at the base commissary. Sarah was shopping for basic supplies when she ran into Sergeant Martinez, her crew chief. Martinez had been maintaining aircraft for 12 years, and his opinion mattered to every pilot in the squadron. "Major," Martinez said, approaching with his usual respectful demeanor, "I wanted to thank you for something." "Thank me?" "Sergeant, I should be thanking you. That aircraft performed flawlessly because of your maintenance." Martinez shook his head. "Ma'am, that's not what I'm talking about. My daughter is 16, and she's been talking about joining the military after she graduates. For years, I've been trying to talk her out of it. Not because I don't believe in service, but because I worried about how she'd be treated, whether she'd be given real opportunities." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "But when I told her about what you did, about how you saved those men, her whole face lit up. For the first time, she could see herself in a military uniform, not as a token or an experiment, but as someone who could make a real difference. You gave her something I couldn't, a vision of what's possible." The conversation with Martinez helped Sarah understand something important about her situation. The attention she was receiving wasn't just about her individual actions. It was about representation, about possibilities, about showing people that heroism came in many forms. But understanding didn't make the pressure any easier to bear. The requests for interviews continued, along with invitations to speak at military academies, veterans events, and congressional hearings. Each request came with good intentions and valid reasons, but together they threatened to transform Sarah from a pilot into a full-time symbol. The solution came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, now recovered from his wounds, requested permission to visit Bagram Airfield. When he arrived, he sought out Sarah immediately. "Major," Morrison said as they sat in the pilot's lounge, "I need to apologize to you." Sarah was confused. "Apologize?" "Commander, you have nothing to apologize for. You and your team performed exceptionally under impossible circumstances. That's not what I'm apologizing for. I'm apologizing for what happened afterward. When I started talking to reporters, when I pushed for recognition, I was thinking about honoring your actions. I didn't consider what that attention would do to your life, to your ability to do your job." Morrison looked tired, older than when Sarah had first heard his voice on the radio during the mission. "Major, I've been watching the coverage, reading the articles, seeing how this story has grown beyond what either of us intended. I know what it's like to have your identity reduced to a single moment, no matter how significant that moment was. It's not fair, and it's not sustainable." Sarah appreciated Morrison's honesty, but she also understood that the situation had moved beyond anyone's ability to control. "Commander, I appreciate what you're saying, but this isn't anyone's fault. Sometimes things take on a life of their own. Maybe, but that doesn't mean we have to let that life define us. Major, you saved my team because you refuse to accept that some situations are impossible. Maybe it's time to apply that same principle to your current situation." Morrison's words stayed with Sarah long after he left Bagram. Over the following days, she began to develop a strategy for managing her newfound fame while maintaining her identity as a pilot and an officer. The strategy was simple in concept, but challenging in execution. Sarah would accept selected speaking engagements and interviews, but only those that served a larger purpose beyond personal recognition. She would use her platform to highlight the contributions of all the people who made missions successful: the maintainers, the intelligence analysts, the air traffic controllers, and the ground forces who trusted pilots to have their backs. More importantly, she would continue flying combat missions. Despite suggestions from some superiors that she might be more valuable in a training or public relations role, Sarah insisted on maintaining her operational status. She was a pilot first, a celebrity second, and she intended to keep it that way. The first test of this strategy came when she was invited to speak at the Air Force Academy. Sarah accepted, but she brought Sergeant Martinez with her to discuss aircraft maintenance. And she insisted that the presentation focus on team operations rather than individual heroics. Standing before an auditorium filled with future officers, Sarah looked out at faces that reminded her of her younger self. Eager, determined, slightly overwhelmed by the possibilities ahead of them. The mission we're here to discuss today wasn't successful because one person did something extraordinary, Sarah began. It was successful because every person involved, from the intelligence analysts who provided targeting information to the maintenance technicians who kept the aircraft flying, understood their role in a larger mission. She spoke for 30 minutes about systems, procedures, and the importance of training. But in the final moments of her presentation, she addressed the elephant in the room. You've probably heard this mission described in dramatic terms, and some of that drama is accurate. It was dangerous, it was challenging, and yes, it required some unconventional tactics. But the most important lesson isn't about what happened in the cockpit. It's about what happened before I ever took off. Sarah gestured to Martinez, who had been discussing pre-flight procedures. Sergeant Martinez and his team had prepared that aircraft so thoroughly that it could absorb damage that should have been catastrophic and still keep flying. The intelligence team had provided such detailed information about enemy positions that I could make tactical decisions based on reliable data. The ground team had maintained discipline and communication under extreme pressure, giving me the information I needed to be effective. She paused, making eye contact with as many cadets as possible. The lesson isn't that one person can overcome impossible odds through individual heroism. The lesson is that when everyone does their job with excellence and dedication, the impossible becomes achievable. That's what military service is really about, being part of something larger than yourself. As Sarah concluded her presentation and fielded questions from the cadets, she realized that she had found a way to honor the attention she had received while staying true to her values. She could be a symbol without losing her identity, a hero without abandoning her humanity. But even as she developed strategies for managing fame, Sarah knew that the most important test was still ahead. In a few weeks, she would return to flying combat missions, to the world where reputation mattered less than performance, where the only measure of success was bringing everyone home safely. The mission that had made her famous was over, but the mission that defined her as a pilot, as an officer, and as a person continued every day. And Sarah Chun was determined to meet that challenge with the same commitment and skill that had turned a suicide mission into a legend. 6 months after the mission that changed everything, Sarah Chun found herself facing a different kind of impossible situation. The legend that had grown around her actions was both opening doors and closing them, creating opportunities while limiting her choices. But the true test of who she had become wouldn't come from fame or recognition. It would come from a moment she had to prove that she was still the same pilot who had refused to accept defeat in an Afghan valley. The morning started like many others at Bagram Airfield, with routine briefings and standard mission assignments. But as Sarah entered the operations center, she could sense something different in the atmosphere. Conversations stopped when she passed, and colleagues exchanged glances that suggested important news was circulating. Colonel Hawthorne called her into his office before the general briefing began. As Sarah took her familiar seat across from his desk, she noticed several official documents spread across the surface, including what appeared to be transfer orders. Sarah, Hawthorne began, using her first name in a way that suggested this conversation would be different from their usual professional exchanges. I've got good news and challenging news. Which would you like first? Let's start with the challenging news, sir. I've found it's usually easier to handle the good news after dealing with the problems. Hawthorne smiled at her practical approach. The Pentagon wants you back in Washington. They're offering you a position in the Air Force Public Affairs Office, with a promotion to lieutenant colonel and a guarantee of interesting assignments that would put your talents to good use. Sarah felt her stomach drop. A Pentagon assignment meant leaving flying status, leaving the cockpit for a desk job that would maximize her value as a symbol while minimizing her effectiveness as a pilot. And the good news, sir? The good news is that I told them you would decline the offer. Sarah looked up, surprised. Sir, did I miss something? Shouldn't that decision be mine to make? Normally, yes. But I know you well enough to know that you'd rather fly missions than attend meetings, and I know the Air Force well enough to know that it needs pilots more than it needs another staff officer, even a famous one. Hawthorne leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. But, Sarah, this isn't going to be the last offer. Your story has taken on a life of its own, and there are people who want to use that story for purposes that have nothing to do with your effectiveness as a pilot. You need to be prepared for pressure that will come from directions you don't expect. As if to emphasize his point, Hawthorne handed her a folder containing newspaper clippings, magazine articles, and internet printouts. The headlines told a story that was both familiar and disturbing. Female pilot proves women belong in combat. Air Force diversity, success story saves lives, and the future of military aviation is female. I never said any of those things, Sarah said as she flipped through the articles. These quotes are either taken out of context or completely fabricated. I know, but that's what happens when you become a symbol. People project their own agendas onto your story, whether you agree with those agendas or not. The question is, how do you want to handle it? Sarah set the folder aside and looked directly at her commanding officer. Sir, I want to keep flying combat missions. Everything else is secondary. I hope you'd say that, because I've got a mission that requires your specific skills, and it's the kind of assignment that will either reinforce your reputation or end it entirely. Hawthorne pulled out a classified briefing folder and placed it on the desk between them. Intelligence has located a high-value target in the mountains near the Pakistani border. Same general area where you made your reputation, but the situation is even more complex this time. Sarah opened the folder and immediately understood why Hawthorne had wanted to discuss this privately. The target was a Taliban commander who had been responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces for over 3 years. He was meeting with Pakistani ISI agents to plan a major offensive, and the meeting was taking place in a compound that was heavily defended and located in extremely challenging terrain. Sir, this looks like a job for special operations, not close air support. Normally, you'd be right, but the compound is located in a valley that's even more confined than the one where you rescued Morrison's team. Ground forces can't get close enough without being detected, and traditional airstrikes would cause too much collateral damage. We need precision engagement from someone who can operate in confined spaces under heavy fire. Sarah studied the intelligence photos and tactical assessments. The mission would require flying through a narrow canyon, engaging targets with surgical precision, and extracting successfully despite concentrated enemy fire. It was the kind of mission that tacticians would normally label as too risky to attempt. Who else knows about this mission? Currently, just the planning team and senior leadership. But, Sarah, I need you to understand something. If you take this mission and succeed, it will reinforce every story that's been written about you. You'll be the pilot who can do the impossible, and that reputation will follow you for the rest of your career. Hawthorne paused, making sure he had her complete attention. But if you fail, if something goes wrong, the same people who are calling you a hero now will question everything. They'll say you were promoted beyond your abilities because of politics, that the first mission was luck, that the Air Force took unnecessary risks to maintain a narrative. Sarah understood the implications. Success would cement her legend, but potentially limit her future options. Failure would destroy her reputation and possibly her career. It was the kind of decision that defined not just a mission, but a life. When do we launch? Hawthorne smiled. I knew you'd say that too. Mission brief is in 2 hours. Launch is scheduled for tomorrow at 0600. The mission briefing was smaller than usual, limited to essential personnel who had been cleared for the operation. As Sarah listened to the intelligence officer describe the target and the challenges, she found herself thinking not about fame or reputation, but about the tactical problems that needed to be solved. The compound was located at the bottom of a canyon that was barely wide enough for aircraft operations. The approach would have to be made at low altitude, through a corridor that was covered by multiple anti-aircraft positions. The target building was surrounded by civilian structures, requiring precision that left no room for error. But Sarah also saw opportunities that others might miss. The canyon walls would provide cover for her approach, masking her aircraft from radar detection until the final moments. The enemy's confidence in their defensive positions might make them slow to react to an unexpected attack profile. After the briefing, Sarah spent the evening preparing both tactically and mentally. She studied satellite photos until she could visualize every rock formation in the target area. She reviewed her aircraft's capabilities and limitations, calculating fuel consumption, ammunition requirements, and damage tolerance. But she also spent time thinking about the broader implications of the mission. Win or lose, this would likely be her last opportunity to define herself primarily as a pilot rather than as a symbol. After this mission, regardless of the outcome, she would be too valuable politically to risk in routine combat operations. The thought should have been depressing, but Sarah found it oddly liberating. If this was to be her last chance to prove herself in the cockpit, she intended to make it count. The morning of the mission brought clear skies and perfect flying weather. As Sarah completed her pre-flight checks, Sergeant Martinez approached with his usual meticulous attention to detail. "Major, your bird is as ready as I can make her. All systems are perfect, ordnance is configured for precision engagement, and I've personally inspected every component that might be critical." Sarah nodded her appreciation. "Thanks, Sergeant. How are things with your daughter? Is she still planning on joining the military?" Martinez smiled proudly. "Yes, ma'am. She's decided on the Air Force Academy. Says she wants to be a pilot like you. Tell her that being a pilot means being part of a team. The pilot gets the attention, but missions succeed because everyone does their job perfectly." As Sarah taxied toward the runway, she thought about Martinez's daughter, about the cadets that she had spoken to, about all the people who might be watching to see whether the legend could live up to the reality. The flight to the target area was routine until the final approach. As Sarah descended into the canyon, she immediately understood why conventional aircraft had been ruled out for this mission. The walls rose steeply on both sides, creating a corridor so narrow that her wingtips seemed to almost touch the rock faces. But the confined space also worked in her favor. Her approach was completely masked from enemy radar, and the anti-aircraft positions were oriented to defend against attacks from above, not from within the canyon itself. The first indication that her presence had been detected came when tracer rounds began streaking past her cockpit. But by then, Sarah was already lining up her attack run, her targeting system locked onto the building where intelligence indicated the meeting was taking place. The precision required was extraordinary. The target building was surrounded by civilian structures, schools, and residential areas. A mistake of even a few meters would result in civilian casualties that would turn a tactical success into a strategic disaster. Sarah's first shots were perfect. The 30mm cannon rounds struck the target building with surgical precision, eliminating the structure while leaving surrounding buildings untouched. Secondary explosions indicated that the building had contained ammunition or explosives, confirming that intelligence had been accurate about its military significance. But success came with a price. As Sarah pulled up from her attack run, concentrated anti-aircraft fire began tracking her aircraft. Unlike her previous mission, this time the enemy was prepared for unconventional attack profiles. Taking heavy fire, Sarah reported as her aircraft shuddered from multiple impacts. "Target is destroyed, but I'm going to need medical assistance after landing." The extraction from the canyon was even more challenging than the approach. Damage control systems made the aircraft difficult to handle, and enemy fire was now coming from multiple directions as defenders throughout the area responded to the attack. But Sarah had learned something during her previous mission that served her well now. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead of fighting the damaged aircraft, she worked with it, using her understanding of aerodynamics and her aircraft design characteristics to maintain control despite the mechanical failures. The emergency landing at Bagram was controlled but dramatic. Emergency vehicles lined the runway as Sarah's smoking aircraft touched down hard and rolled to a stop just short of the overrun area. As Sarah climbed out of the cockpit, she was surprised to find Colonel Hawthorne waiting for her, along with several senior officers she didn't recognize. "Major Chun," Hawthorne said, his voice filled with relief and admiration. "Initial reports indicate the mission was a complete success. The target was eliminated with no collateral damage, and intelligence suggests that several other high-value individuals were also present in the building." But Sarah's attention was focused on something else. Standing behind the senior officers was a young woman in civilian clothes who looked remarkably like Sergeant Martinez. "Major," the young woman said as she approached, "I'm Maria Martinez, Sergeant Martinez's daughter. I wanted to thank you for what you've done, not just today, but for showing people like me what's possible." Sarah looked at the young woman who represented the future of military aviation, at the officers who would determine her own future, and at the aircraft that had carried her through another impossible mission. "Maria," Sarah said, removing her helmet and smiling despite her exhaustion, "the most important thing I can tell you is this. Being a pilot isn't about doing the impossible. It's about preparing so thoroughly, training so completely, and working with such exceptional people that the impossible becomes achievable." As the crowd dispersed and the immediate excitement of the mission began to fade, Sarah found herself alone with Colonel Hawthorne. "So what happens now, sir? More offers from Washington? More requests for interviews?" Hawthorne looked at the damaged aircraft, then back at Sarah. "Actually, I think things might be different this time. You've proven that your first mission wasn't luck or a fluke. You've demonstrated that you can consistently perform at the highest level under the most challenging circumstances. That's not celebrity, Sarah. That's credibility." Over the following weeks, the predictions proved accurate. While there was media coverage of the second mission, it focused more on tactical excellence than on drama or symbolism. Military analysts praised the precision of the attack and the innovative approach profile. But the tone was different from the coverage after her first mission. This time, Sarah was being discussed as an exceptional pilot rather than as a phenomenon. The change was reflected in how her colleagues treated her as well. The distance that had developed after her first mission began to close as other pilots recognized that her success came from skill and preparation rather than luck or favoritism. She was still famous, but she was famous for being exceptionally good at her job. 6 months later, Sarah received the promotion to lieutenant colonel that had been offered earlier, but this time it came with a squadron command rather than a desk job in Washington. Her new assignment would involve training the next generation of close air support pilots, passing on the lessons she had learned through experience rather than theory. On her last day at Bagram, Sarah took a final walk around the flight line, visiting the aircraft and the people who had been part of her journey. She stopped at the maintenance hangar where Sergeant Martinez was working on an aircraft identical to the one she had flown on her 2 most famous missions. "Sergeant, I wanted to thank you one more time for everything you did to keep me flying." Martinez looked up from his work and smiled. "Major, excuse me, Colonel, it was an honor. And I wanted you to know that Maria was accepted to the Air Force Academy. She starts next month. Tell her that being a pilot is about more than flying aircraft. It's about being part of something larger than yourself, something that matters." As Sarah walked toward the aircraft that would take her to her new assignment, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. The missions that had made her famous were behind her, but the mission that defined her as an officer and as a person continued. She had learned that heroes weren't people who did impossible things. Heroes were people who refused to accept that some things were impossible, who prepared thoroughly for challenges they hoped they would never face, and who understood that individual excellence meant nothing without collective commitment. The SEALs had called her mission suicide. She had turned it into legend. But the real achievement wasn't the legend itself. It was the understanding that legends were just stories people told about ordinary people who chose to be extraordinary when circumstances demanded it. As her aircraft lifted off from Afghan soil for the final time, Sarachin looked down at the rugged landscape where she had learned the most important lessons of her career. She had come to Afghanistan as a competent pilot. She was leaving as something more, a leader who understood that the greatest victories came not from individual heroism, but from the collective refusal to abandon the people who counted on you. The war would continue. Other pilots would face impossible missions, and new heroes would emerge. But Sarah carried with her the knowledge that sometimes the most important battle wasn't the one you fought in the sky. It was the one you fought within yourself, the battle between what was easy and what was right, between what was safe and what was necessary. She had won that battle twice in the mountains of Afghanistan, but she understood now that she would face it again and again throughout her career in different forms and different circumstances. And each time, she would remember the lesson she had learned in the cockpit of a damaged A-10 over a narrow valley. Sometimes the difference between suicide and heroism was simply the refusal to quit. The legend would follow her wherever she went, but it no longer defined her. She was Sarah Chun, a pilot, an officer, and a leader who had learned that the impossible was just another word for untried. And in a world that constantly presented new challenges, new impossible situations, that knowledge was worth more than any amount of fame or recognition. As her aircraft disappeared into the distance, carrying her toward new challenges and new opportunities to serve, Sarah Chun smiled and began planning her next mission. Because for a pilot who had turned suicide into legend, there was always another mountain to climb, always another impossible situation waiting to become achievable.